So now we're in GTO Plus, and we're going to start with our first example, and we're going to start configuring the game details for our first example. And before I actually jump into the example itself, and before I really dig into any example, I like to start filling out a study template. And I'll drag this over here so we can kind of see what I'm talking about here. But basically, I like to keep good notes as to the details of both the inputs of what I'm trying to accomplish and the outputs or my observations of the solves. And I would highly recommend that you all do something similar to this. I actually have study templates available on my lukic.io site, which at some point I will be moving over to the Solver School site in the pretty close future. So if you're watching this after February or March timeframe in 2022, it might already be over on the Solver School site by now. But basically, I like to have a nice repository for me to write some details about the particular situation that I'm studying. And the components that I like to include within this study template are things like the board. So we're looking at a 964 rainbow board, the pot size, the effective stacks. I do like to kind of note here what the blinds are in this particular notation. So here I can kind of read this and say the effective stacks are 197, the pot size is 6.5, and the blinds are 0.5 and 1. So it kind of tells me that everything's in big blinds here, because I know that the big blind is 1, which is big in big blinds. I calculate the SPR. I account for the fact if I have rake or not. I like to have a little detail on what the formation of the game is, and then what perspective am I looking at this scenario through. And then I have some overall notes on the board. And what I've just done here is copy-pasted the notes from the slides, but we can go through them kind of briefly to talk through what it is that we're actually trying to solve here. So in this example one, our primary question is, how should we be constructing a single bet strategy on this 964 rainbow board? We are the button, and we are looking at this from the perspective of the button, and we raised first in, and the big blind has defended. Now this is a 5-10 cash game with timed rake. We have some observations that our big blind is a break-even recreational player, and he or she is studied enough to understand high-level range concepts, but will not 3-bet from the blinds enough, particularly with weaker hands. And that piece of information is going to be helpful for us in our next set of videos when we are building out ranges. We'll also know that the big blind here will not check raise at the appropriate frequencies post-flop, and then the big blind will be sticky and inelastic to price with hands that connect with the board on the flop, but will not continue past turns without good equity. And those two pieces of information we can take into account when we are building out our post-flop work. So as we start diving into node locking and things like that, we can start accounting for this information in modules 4 and module 5. And then I have some iterations down here, and I'm not suggesting that we always include 8. We can make this as short or as long as we like, but I like to, as I mentioned, I think the value of solvers comes from running multiple solves and looking at how when we change one input but keep the rest of our inputs constant, seeing how that one input variation affects the output. I think that's where a lot of the value that we're going to derive from solvers comes from. So making sure that we have a place in which we can actually write all of the details of all of those solves, what the components, so maybe we can kind of, if you want to have a little bit more info here as to kind of what the input details are. And then I like to include some metrics like equity, EV percentage, and equity realization. And then when I look at the outputs, I include some notes or conclusions that I might make or observations about those individual solves. As you can see here, I actually have 3 iterations already mapped out, and We'll get into that in a second, specifically when we dive into the bet sizing groups. But specifically, again, the question that we're trying to ask here is, how should we be constructing a single bet strategy on this board? So when I first see that, what that tells me is, in order to conduct some tests to determine the answer to this question, we're going to have to be varying bet sizes, most specifically. Now, we might be varying ranges, we might be varying other components as well too, but the major thing that we're going to have to vary to determine an answer for is bet sizes. The alternative would be is if we're looking to understand the range construction of how we might play a certain scenario, but we might want to sit in the confines of a very formulaic bet strategy that we've already put into place. Well, in those cases, we're not necessarily going to be varying bet sizes as much or at all. But anyways, that's the details on this template, and we're going to be filling it out over the course of these example videos throughout modules 3, 4, and 5. Well, let's go back to the video at hand, and I'll drag this back over to my other screen. We are looking to fill out game details here. And as we noted here that this is a 5-10 cash game, our effective stacks are 197 big blinds. So our button player opens the 3 big blinds, the small blind folds, and the big blind defends. So the pot size is 6.5 blinds. It is a timed rake game, so there is no rake that's taken out. So our starting pot is 6.5 big blinds. Our effective stacks are 197 big blinds, and we are playing on a 964 rainbow board. Now, in GTO Plus, if we actually want to get to the next screen, we do have to fill ranges out first. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit aces for both of these, and I'm going to put one hand for both of these, but we'll come back to this in the next video when we actually enter ranges. Now, the good thing about entering game details is that there's not typically a lot of variation here. So there's not a lot of choices that we can make that might differ from the actual scenario that took place, or there's not a lot of assumptions, I guess I should say, that we can make here. So our board is our board, and in this case here, our board is the 9 of clubs, 6 of diamonds, and 4 of spades. Now, as I mentioned in some of the lecture, that there is a concept called suit isomorphism, which means that we can build this board out in a variety of different ways. As long as the structure of that board remains the same, the output is going to remain the same. So there are a lot of different ways I can actually write a 964 rainbow board. I could do 9 of hearts, 6 of clubs, 4 of diamonds. I could do 9 of hearts, 6 of diamonds, 4 of spades. I could do 9 of clubs, 6 of hearts, 4 of diamonds, right? So there's a lot of different ways in which we can iterate and construct a 964 rainbow board. We're going to use the example that we gave, but just so that you know, these different iterations of that same board, they're all going to yield the same outputs, barring us having, individual suits. So the individual suit differences are going to be a thing. There might be certain things that we would do with a backdoor draw that if we change up the board a little bit, those specific combos might not act the same way, but its comparable combo when we switch out to a different board will act the same way. So once I've selected my board, I'm going to click Done and then click Build Tree. And the next thing I need to do is enter these game details right here, and then I've finished entering my game details. Now I've already started this, and as you can see, I've kind of been building out some tests on the side as it is already, but my starting pot here in this case here is 6.5. Our effective stacks are 197, and we're doing this in blinds. As we've mentioned before, I could choose to do this however I want, as long as my units are consistent. So if I chose to do this in dollars, my starting pot would just be $65, and the effective stacks will be $1,970. Either way, it's the same exact thing. As long as my units are the same, all that really matters here is the ratio of the two. But once I do choose a set of units, I have to be consistent anytime I am doing things in that measurement throughout the rest of the game tree construction. And all the outputs are going to be measured at the same level of units as well too. So any outputs that we have in EV or things like that, that's all going to be in big blinds. So I'm choosing to look at this in terms of big blinds. Our rake is going to be 0. here because we do not have rake in this hand. And then once I put the rake at 0, the cap doesn't necessarily matter in this particular hand. And that's essentially it as it relates to entering the game details. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hop over to example 2, where we look at the second example. It's our also button versus big blind example, but we've kind of flipped the script and now it's the big blinds perspective. So we're going to look at example 2 in GTO Plus and configure the game details for that. I'll see you over there. For our second example, we are flipping the script a little bit and we are looking at the out of position defense perspective. So it's still our 9-6-4 board. It's still our button open versus big blind example, but now we're looking at this from the big blinds perspective. I'll bring over my study sheet here to just kind of show you what I have. And now, again, all of the example is the exact same, but we're looking at it from the big blinds perspective. Our primary question here is, how should I be adjusting my big blind flop defense strategy against an opponent who continuation bets with 100% of range? This is a 2-5 cash game. So in this cash game here, we do have rake. So the rake is 10% up to $8. Our button is a professional player. We've seen him or her at the casino playing regularly, often has a big chip stack. The button will err on the side of aggression, and then the button has lost a few big pots in the last hour and appears to be visibly irritated. So all things to consider in this particular hand. So let's start with the game details for here, and I'll just add my hands real fast. We'll jump back into the ranges in the next video and we'll adjust those. Now our board is going to again be the same 9-6-4 board, and I'm going to click done and build the tree. Our starting pot here now is going to be a little bit different because we are playing a 2-5 cash game. So because we're playing a 2-5 cash game and the small blind is not half the big blind, our starting pot is actually going to be 6.4 big blinds, because our small blind here is $2, which is 0.4 big blinds. And when the small blind folds, that 0.4 kind of stays in the pot here. So now it's 6.4, not going to change things significantly, but again, just so that you note here, it's not 6.5, it's 6.4. And effective stacks are 197. There is rake in this scenario, as I've mentioned here. The rake is 10% up to $8. So I have to include 10%, and the up to $8 is the cap. Now, as you can see, it's already saved the value that I ran a test on this already, and it's already saved that value in here. But the 1.6 cap that we have here is the $8 converted over to big blinds. As I've mentioned to you, your units have to be consistent here. So because I've included these in big blinds, my cap has to be in big blinds as well too, which is 1.6 big blinds. If all of this was in dollars, I would just have my starting pot is a 2-5 game, so my starting pot would be $32. The effective stacks here would be $985, and my cap would be $8. This would yield the same exact thing as the first scenario that I put together. So, but I'm going to put this back to the 6.4, 197, and 1.6 cap. So those are the game details for this scenario. Now we're going to end this video, and in the next video, we can actually dive into examples 3 and 4, which are looking at 3-bet pots and digging through PioSolver. So I'll see you over in the next video where we look at game details using PioSolver.